Es emocionante ver a tanta gente en esta respuesta tan entusiasta que hemos recibido. Anunciamos la charla y a la hora habían algo así como 150 personas inscritas. Ya van más de 600, pero bueno, noto que la sala está llena, es posible que lleguen más personas. Es realmente un honor tener a Tim Ingold acá, es tercera vez que está en Chile, un placer, y por lo cual estamos sumamente agradecidos de él y de su señora. Él sabe que yo estoy haciendo esta introducción en español para ustedes, y entiendo que hay una traducción simultánea para quienes no hablen inglés, ¿no? Pueden recoger audífonos si quisieran. Espero lo hayan hecho ya a la entrada. Bueno, es realmente un placer y estamos muy agradecidos de Tim y Ana. Y quisiera, antes de introducir a Tim, agradecer brevemente a las personas, a las instituciones que han hecho posible que Tim esté acá. En primer lugar, la Universidad Católica, por supuesto. Al mismo tiempo, la generosidad del Congreso Futuro de permitirnos que Tim dé esta charla hoy. Y también la Escuela de Antropología y, por supuesto, el programa de doctorado de la Escuela de Antropología. Bueno, Tim, para ser muy breve, acordamos que hace una introducción breve, es profesor emérito en Antropología Social en la Universidad de Aberdeen. Ha desarrollado trabajo de campo entre los Sami y comunidades en Finlandia, en Lapland, y ha escrito extensamente sobre ambiente, tecnología y organización social en el norte circumpolar. Ha escrito sobre animales en la sociedad humana, o en las sociedades humanas, y sobre ecología humana y evolución o teoría evolutiva. Su trabajo más reciente explora la percepción en contextos ambientales y el desarrollo de habilidades en contextos de práctica. Y sus intereses actuales se yacen o se imbrican con el diálogo entre la antropología, la arqueología, el arte y la arquitectura. Sus libros incluyen una lista larga, para nombrar algunos más, los más importantes en su idioma original: The Perception of the Environment en 2000, Líneas en 2007, Being Alive en 2011, Making en 2013, The Life of Lines en 2015, Anthropology and as Education en 2018, Anthropology Why It Matters, nuevamente en 2018, Correspondences en 2020, Imagining for Real en 2022, and The Rise and Fall of Generations Now en 2024, su último libro. Ingold es miembro de la Academia Británica y de la Sociedad Real de Edimburgo, y en 2022 recibió un CBE, es una condecoración de la realeza británica por su servicio a la antropología. Tim, es un placer, el espacio es tuyo.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you all very much for coming. Some 300 years ago, philosophers in Europe instigated a program for universal human improvement that would come to be known as the Enlightenment. Their program rested on a newfound confidence in the faculty of reason, a faculty considered universal to human beings and to have been uniquely bestowed upon them by their creator. Empowered by reason, they thought, humankind had the potential to liberate itself from the constraints that bind all other earthly creatures within the confines of the natural world, and to reach for the heights of civilization. They could become the masters of nature. Of course, the program had its antecedents. It could not have come from nowhere. Already in the 15th and 16th centuries, scholars, artists, and poets of the European Renaissance, calling themselves humanists, and drawing on newfound precedents from ancient Greece and Rome, were challenging the traditional authority of the Christian Church by prioritizing the achievements of this life over preparation for the next, with a philosophy that accorded pride of place to human dignity, moral freedom, and the exercise of intellect. But it was with the Enlightenment that humanism finally threw off the burden of theology to become a curriculum for progress that looked for guidance and inspiration above all to science rather than religion. Over the ensuing centuries, this philosophy would underwrite developments in education, governance, science, technology, and medicine, which, as they gathered pace, would spread around the globe with trade and colonization, and go on to transform the lives of millions. That Enlightenment humanism has contributed immensely to the common good is indeed undeniable. Human beings are living, on average, longer and in better health than ever before. More people than ever before can read and write, enjoy the relative comforts of modern life, and widen their horizons through travel and tourism. And more are benefiting from the civic institutions that foster the development of the arts and sciences, and from the instruments of democracy that allow citizens to participate in the political process. Yet all this has come at a cost in two respects. First, in driving a wedge between humanity and nature, the very planet which had once offered nourishment and support for human life came to be seen as a repository of resources to be plundered, unloosing an unfettered extraction of materials on an industrial scale, which has ravaged the earth and jeopardized its capacity for renewal. Second, while the appeal to universal human entitlement serves the interests of those empowered to lay claim to it, for others, the forcible imposition of this claim has brought only impoverishment and oppression. In struggles for supremacy, the flag of humanity has always been flown by the victorious, treating as less than human those who have come under their yoke. And as these twin costs have inexorably risen, what began as an agenda for the emancipation of peoples from around the world has morphed into a vicious spiral of environmental destruction and social injustice. 300 years of progress, it seems, far from delivering humanity to a promised land of peace and plenty, leave us looking into an abyss. Where then did it all go so wrong? How come that the road to civilization, which it laid out for us to follow, has instead led to social breakdown and planetary ruin? Well, in hindsight, the tragic outcome was already inevitable from the moment when, in the 18th century, philosophers of the Enlightenment decreed that the proper vocation for humankind lay not in following in the footsteps of ancestors, aligning the ways along which human lives are led with the ways of the manifold beings of other kinds with which they used to coexist, but in turning their backs on these creaturely ways to face resolutely in the opposite direction. According to the humanist myth of origin, it was in this one mighty moment, a turning point without precedent in the evolution of life, that true humanity broke free from its primordial roots and, guided by the light of reason, embarked upon its long ascent. 3 centuries later, the myth retains as powerful a hold on the modern imagination as it ever did. It continues to motivate scientists in their quest to discover the origins of humanity in a revolutionary episode when our distant ancestors, tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, crossed the line from living a life on a par with non-human primates to become so-called modern humans, people like us, already pre-equipped with the capacities to do everything we do today. In the historical realization of these capacities lay the promise of civilization. And this is a revolution, moreover, supposedly recapitulated in the life of every child as they mature from an original, purely biological condition of infancy to become a fully fledged socio-cultural being, endowed with an assertive sense of self and the power to change the world. In the idiom of modernity, this turnaround nails a claim to essential humanity, as much in the lifetime of the individual as in the evolution of the species as a whole. Our earliest ancestors may have been human beings by descent, as indeed are our own children, but only having crossed the line to civility would their humanity be fully realized. And in the crossing, they would be raised above beings of all other kinds. The human is always more than. The rest is merely animal, merely biological, merely natural. Indeed, the very idea of humanity appears charged with what contemporary critics call exceptionalism. I shall return to this charge, not to reject it, but rather to lay it on its side, investing it with a power not of superiority, but of love. I want to begin, however, with the word for the world from which, in the modern mind, everything begins, namely nature. It has become almost a truism amongst anthropologists of my generation to observe that the concept of nature was invented by thinkers of the European Enlightenment, in tandem with the doctrine that the destiny of humanity is to conquer it. As such, it referred to a material realm as yet untrammeled by human contact. Its fauna and flora still ran wild, and if there were people in this state of nature, they too would have been living like beasts. Yet to embark on the civilizing mission, which began living like beasts, yet to embark on the civilizing mission, which began not only with the cultivation of plants and the domestication of animals, but also with the disciplining of their own basic instincts. A special place was reserved in the modern imagination for these primordial denizens of the natural world. They would come to be known as savages, or latterly as hunters and gatherers. And this did not bode well for those of the world's indigenous peoples deemed to fit this description, as their lands were overrun by waves of colonization. Considered to have no more right to these lands than the creatures they hunted, nor to have established any claim through tilling the soil, many were forcibly removed, herded into reservations, or just wiped out. Today, and for good reason, their decimation has been at the center of the post-colonial critique of settler colonialism and its abuses. What this critique tells us is that assertions about the existence and constitution of nature are very far from simple statements of fact, of what is objectively out there, regardless of the presence or interests of humans. They are rather claims, and the aggressive prosecution of these claims by agents with the power to enforce them can be a matter of life or death for subaltern populations. The concept of nature, we learn, is inherently and intensely political. What matters then is not what nature really means, but what claims are being made with it. And of these, perhaps the most deep-seated is the claim, enshrined in the founding charter of modernity, that the future for humanity lies in the overthrow of its primitive past. Yet nothing could be further from the minds of indigenous peoples themselves, who, far from having failed to carve out a space for themselves from amidst an untamed and inchoate wilderness, have sought to maintain a modus vivendi by which beings of every kind, human and non-human, can get along together. Unsurprisingly, anthropological research among extant so-called hunters and gatherers found no evidence that anything corresponding to our concept of nature exists in their vocabularies. Back in 1992, I contributed to a symposium entitled Beyond Nature and Culture, with a review of ethnographic literature from regions ranging from the circumpolar north to tropical Africa, Southeast Asia, and Aboriginal Australia. And without exception, these studies showed that indigenous hunter-gatherers were anything but losers in a perpetual combat with alien forces of a nature that they lacked the wit to control. To the contrary, they perceived their environment to be permeated by relations of conviviality, encompassing humans and non-humans alike. Yet, just as the word human long predates the concept of humanity, so the word nature is very much older than its incorporation into the vocabulary of Enlightenment humanism as the object of a science that would rest its authority on the alleged supremacy of reason. In hindsight, I now realize that I and the majority of my anthropological colleagues, in our eagerness to topple the concept of nature from its pedestal and to dismiss it as an artifact of modernity, had failed to grasp the significance of the word in its earlier pre-modern inflections. And these go back at least as far as around the year 50 BCE, before the Christian era, when the Roman author Titus Lucretius Carus composed his magnificent prose poem De Rerum Natura, of the nature of things. Here he addresses nature, fondly in the feminine, as the creatress, in Latin creatrix, of all there is. Etymologically, her name comes from the Latin verb nascere, to be born, and it connotes a power at large in the cosmos to give birth to new life. Taken in this sense, it is absolutely not the case that no equivalents to the concept of nature exist in the vocabularies of indigenous peoples. On the contrary, it is usual for those who find themselves in a milieu permeated by animate powers, often described by their ethnographers as spiritual, it's usual for them to speak of their world in precisely these terms. I would even hazard a guess that there can be no people still drawing a living from the lands and waters of this earth who lack some concept corresponding to the meaning of nature in antiquity. Could it be then that the champions of modernity, in turning their backs on nature and usurping all powers of creation for their human selves, have repudiated its very natality, its power to give birth, which Lucretius placed at the heart of his deliberations, and which is so central to indigenous cosmogonies? What if we were to turn around once again, to resume a posture in which the temporal direction of our lives is concordant with that of the nature of which we are ourselves begotten, such that we humans could carry on in the company of creatures of other kinds, and they with us as we grow older together? This would be to join with nature in the very unfolding of the life around us. it would be to enter into the indivisible process of life's ongoingness, or with what the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, writing in the 17th century, called natura naturans, nature's naturing. Here it is. Nature's naturing. In this active principle of creation, Spinoza saw the clearest proof of the existence of God. It was the rearward gaze of modernity, looking back over the ways it had come, that reconfigured nature as already natured, as what Spinoza called natura naturata, visible in the passive fallout deposited by the wayside. And with this, nature was turned into an object for secular science. By undoing this reversal, might we restore the original unison of religious and scientific sensibilities that the Enlightenment did so much to split asunder? Could we, after Spinoza, repurpose the concept of nature for a new humanism? Well, as a rule, creatures don't do progress. Generation follows generation along the trails, burrows, and flightways of its predecessors. The direction of travel is always towards where ancestors have been before. That's why every way of life is also a way of remembering. Yet even as they go forth in life, creatures lean over those that follow behind in a gesture of care and attention, even of love. Each generation, as we say colloquially, looks after the next who are following behind. Indeed, for most creatures, their life's work consists in creating the conditions for their offspring to flourish, sometimes in the most unpromising of environments. And in this work, they often display much ingenuity, improvising makeshift arrangements that help them find their way around unexpected impediments, and as and when they crop up. It's a matter of muddling along, always in the midst of things. And human beings, for most of their time on this earth, have done much the same. They too have muddled along, following where other creatures go, as the hunter, for example, follows the trail, or the gatherer, the rhizome, keeping their ancestors before and their descendants aft. We call their ways of life traditions, a word derived from the Latin verb tradere, meaning to hand over or to pass on, as in a relay race, where one runner passes the baton to the next. Every coming generation likewise imparts new momentum to the life process, even as the energy of forebears begins to wane. But unlike the race, tradition is driven by an imperative not to cross the finishing line, but to keep on going. But with the onset of what we now know as the modern era, all this was set to change. Generations of thinkers promising emancipation from the shackles of tradition would denounce ancestral ways as backward and regressive. To progress in life, they said, meant crossing the line, forsaking not only the creaturely ways of non-human companions, but also their own traditions. Each successive generation would claim the present for itself, seeing in the future the vision of a new world coming towards it, destined to replace the old. And its mission was to turn this vision into reality. It would do so by instigating a program of design to establish the universal principles on which this new order would rest, and of education to train the next generation into compliance with it. And with these programs of design and education, a life's work would consist not in introducing the young into old ways, but in building a new world for them to occupy and enforcing the conditions of their entry into it. For modern thinkers, with their targets set upon the future, the past would lie not ahead, but behind. It was over, finished. And the effect of this turnaround was to consign not only the lifeways of non-human kinds to the fallout of a spent past, to natura naturata, for the same fate also awaited human ancestral traditions, always apparently on the verge of disappearing, if not already extinct. These traditions would come to be regarded less as wellsprings of renewal than as vestiges of a bygone past. And it was this turn on nature and tradition that kick-started the modern acceleration. Imagine, if you will, a car speeding down the fast lane of a highway. The metalled road on which nothing grows slices through a world threaded by a rhizomatic mesh of trails, routes, and runners, as much aerial as earthly. Along these lines of life since time immemorial, creatures of all sorts, including humans, have gone about their business. But the driver, strapped to his seat, sees only their reflections caught in the rear view mirrors on either side of his vehicle. He glimpses species of nature on the one side, and on the other, human traditions, both on the point of vanishing into the distance as he speeds forward. But suppose now that we exchange the perspective from the driving seat for that of the inhabitants, both human and non-human, left by the roadside as the driver hurtles by. All at once, the fugitive reflections of nature and tradition come back to life in a world that revolves around the comings and goings of the inhabitants themselves. It is they who hold the center now, while our driver shoots off into the void. Only from this center, in the midst of things, can they discharge their responsibility of care towards the manifold forms of life around them. What matters to them is nature's naturing, its continuous rebirth or natality. And their overriding task is to look after what nature brings forth, rather than to preserve and catalogue its vestigial forms before they disappear. And with this, we arrive at a concept that in modern times is commonly paired with that of nature, but as its complementary opposite. This is the concept of culture. As reflected in the title of the symposium to which I referred a moment ago, Beyond Nature and Culture, anthropologists of my generation have been keen to overthrow a dichotomy that they see as mired in an obsession with binaries peculiar to the Western mindset. Western, by which they mean the humanism of the European Enlightenment. As much as the concept of nature is a modern invention, they argue, so too is the concept of culture. Indeed, it would be as impossible to have one without the other as a mind without a body. And yet, study after study would show that non-Western peoples, and indeed in everyday practice, for most people, even in nominally Western societies, the dichotomy nature-culture makes no sense. Now, some scholars have tried to get around the problem by concocting awkward hybrids, such as nature-culture. Others argue that nature and culture are so wrapped up in one another as to be inseparable. Yet, what critics of the binary have failed to appreciate, almost without exception, is that the concept of culture is no more an invention of the modern era than the concept of nature. Like the latter, like the concept of nature, the concept of culture has been around for more than 2,000 years. What was new to modernity was the specific inflection given to these terms by way of their opposition to human reason and its interests. In fact, the word culture comes again from the Latin verb collere, meaning to cultivate, as in tilling the soil, or in more general terms, taking care of or looking after. And if nature is the power to give birth to new life, then culture, taken in this original sense, refers to the human task to nurture this life in order that it may grow and flourish and continue to reanimate the world for generations to come. With this, nature and culture follow one another, just as in the cycle of life, the labors of birth give way to the work of nourishment. But the modern imagination, having stripped nature of the power of natality, from which it had taken its name, would go on to strip culture of its original connotations of nourishment. As nature's naturing became nature-natured, so culture's culturing became culture-cultured. Reflected in the rear-view mirror of advancing reason, both nature and culture reappear as something like a catalogue of final forms to be conserved for posterity. There is a catalogue of species, known as biodiversity, and the catalogue of cultures, known as ethnic diversity. Once restored, however, to their original meanings of continuous birth and nurturance, the concepts of nature and culture are not only consistent with indigenous sensibilities, they also point the way towards an alternative settlement that could give us hope for times to come. But as we've seen already, to achieve this, we will have to undo the very turn that, for thinkers of the Enlightenment, first set humanity on the high road to civilization. In this turn, both nature and tradition were relegated to a now superseded past. To undo it will mean retracing the ways we had once put behind us, casting our lot with the lives of those who have gone before and those living around, facing in the same direction as them, in seeking an onward path that we can take together. It will mean relearning how to coexist, not just with fellow human beings, but with other creatures as well. And it will mean exchanging the time of chronological succession as generation replaces generation with the duration of life itself as it ceaselessly begets new forms. And herein, I believe, lies the possibility of a new humanism committed not to progress, but to the continuity of life. Just as the path to the future in this new humanism lies in retracing old ways, so it is through the recovery of their old meanings that the concepts of nature and culture indicate a way ahead. But this is no less true of the concept of the human. This concept, too, has an ancient history which long predates the invention of humanity at the birth of the modern era. Already in Roman times, it was being used to refer to persons as opposed to both animals and gods. And it is perhaps by retrieving older currents of thought that we can find a source of renewal for times to come. One figure whose ideas are especially pertinent in this regard was the writer, philosopher, and mystic Ramon Llull. Born in the year 1232, Llull was raised on the island of Majorca, at that time a center of commerce in the Mediterranean world and a melting pot for ideas from Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Though himself of Christian heritage, Llull took pains to learn Arabic and was much influenced by studies in Islamic culture and science. And in the course of a long and eventful life, Llull wrote a staggering 280 books, composed in Latin, Arabic, and his native Catalan. And one of the last of these, written in Genoa in 1303, in his 71st year, was the Logica Nova, New Logic. Now, in Llull's cosmology, as set out in this work, everything is a doing, a happening, a going on. Fire, for example, is not a thing that burns. Fire is burning. Wind is blowing, and so on. To name anything, any phenomenon, we have to begin with the verb and then derive its gerund. So how, Llull wondered, how do we name the human? And to solve the problem, and drawing on his knowledge of Arabic, in which this kind of construction was not unusual, Llull had to devise a new word previously unheard of in Latin, the language of Logica Nova. And that word was homificare, or literally to humanify. The human, Llull declared, is a humanifying animal. Homo est animal homificans. Humanifying, be it noted, is not the same as humanizing. It's not about imprinting the designs of a preformed humanity upon the substance of an already natured nature. That was a modern idea. For humans to humanify, according to Llull, is rather to forge their own and each other's existence within the crucible of a common life. Their humanness, then, is not given from the start, nor is it ever finally achieved. It lies rather in the ceaseless work of co-creation. Indeed, following Llull, we should not really regard humans as beings at all. They are rather becomings. And as such, they are ever unfinished, even as life carries on. And for what they are at any moment in the life process, they bear a collective responsibility. So, to nature's naturing in bringing forth new life, and culture's culturing in its nourishment and care, we can now add the tasks of humans humanifying, intrinsic to productive coexistence. But this only begs further questions. In what precisely do these tasks consist? What, if anything, makes them any different in principle for the ways in which creatures of any other kind prosecute their lives? Critics of a post-humanist persuasion, keen to topple human beings from the throne of reason on which they had been crowned by the Enlightenment, would answer that nothing marks out humans as any more exceptional compared with creatures of other kinds than are the latter from one another. Agents of humanism stand accused by their critics not only of Eurocentrism, of seeing the entire world through the prism of a mentality hatched on their own continent, but also, and more seriously, of anthropocentrism, in placing humanity on a pedestal over and above the rest of creation. And yet, although humanists may reasonably be found guilty on both counts, neither charge on closer scrutiny and as I shall now show, really stacks up. On the first charge, it is of course true that the Enlightenment project originated in Europe. At its core, however, was an appeal to the universality of reason which repudiates any attention to place, region, or continent. Reason, being everywhere, belongs nowhere. And if everyone is equally endowed with reason, then it should in principle make no difference where they come from. Now, admittedly, most humanists of earlier centuries assumed that reason was cultivated to different degrees among different nations on a scale from primitive to civilized, and that in the nations of Europe from which they predominantly came, it was cultivated to the highest degree. That they were biased towards their own kind is undeniable. But this bias was not intrinsic to their philosophy, as it was, for example, for the raceologists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, nominally followers of Charles Darwin, who would attribute the rise of civilization to the ratchet effect of natural selection in notching up hereditary variations of intellectual prowess. They were convinced that white-skinned Europeans were destined to wipe out the multicolored natives of other continents, and they even set out deliberately and genocidally to hasten the process. But the founding fathers of the Enlightenment, for the founding fathers of the Enlightenment, this was never on the agenda. Appealing rather to a doctrine that would later be known as the psychic unity of mankind, they insisted that it was their moral duty to educate the nations of other continents, not to exterminate them. Nor, to turn to the second charge, was it ever part of the Enlightenment program to situate humans at the center of the cosmos. Its aim, in fact, was to achieve the exact opposite, that is, to decenter the human, above all by detaching the faculty of reason, wherein the essence of humanity was supposed to reside, from any worldly involvement whatsoever. And with this, the unity of knowing and being, once centered in a human body open and attentive to its surroundings, was split asunder, as the geographer Augustin Berg tells us, by a dualism between the subjective interior world and the objective exterior world, between mind and the universe. So here is Augustin Berg, a prominent French geographer and philosopher. Paradoxically, the dream of enlightenment, of ultimate human omniscience, which captured the imaginations of our philosophers, has gone hand in hand in modern science with a growing awareness of the sheer immensity of the physical universe, within which the sum of human existence is reduced to a mere flicker on an utterly insignificant planet. But this is also why the charge of human exceptionalism, which so often accompanies accusations of anthropocentrism, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. At stake is the exceptionality of intellect, liberated from its physical moorings in a body reduced to little more than a pinch of stardust. And that calls to overcome anthropocentrism are so often couched in terms of exhortations to reunify and recenter the human body and mind at the very core of the life world, are an index of the contradictions to which the ambivalence of this term, anthropocentrism, has given rise. So rather than dismissing anthropocentrism and human exceptionalism out of hand, as critics of Enlightenment humanism routinely do, I believe that they can be repurposed as foundational to the new humanism I am proposing here. This means acknowledging in the first place that humans really are exceptional compared to the Earth's other than human inhabitants. Now, this claim is bound to be controversial. One of those with whom I'm in controversy is my good friend, colleague, Philippe Descola. And Descola goes so far as to call human exceptionalism a dangerous illusion. But the illusion, I think, lies in the belief that exceptionality necessarily implies superiority. And this belief, in my view, is wholly unwarranted. What makes humans exceptional from a new humanist perspective is not that they are in some sense more than beings of any other kind. Their disposition is characterized by something entirely different. We could call it a love for the world, or amor mundi. And this love was a recurrent, if largely implicit theme in the writings of political philosopher Hannah Arendt, for whom it implies neither a will to dominate and control nor passive acquiescence. Nor is it in the least sentimental. Rather, it entails a responsibility of care towards the world as it is, which is both firm and unconditional. It is a love born from a reverence for the creative power of nature, its natality, and enacted in the world, in the work of culture, in nurturing the new life it brings forth. And for Arendt, it embodies the very essence of the human condition. Now, it is thanks to this love, this amor mundi, that humans carry a burden of responsibility to sustain the balance of nature and ensure its fecundity for generations to come. But it is a burden that can be discharged only from a position at the beating heart of the world itself. And that is why the new humanism is necessarily anthropocentric in the strict sense of the term. Whereas Enlightenment thinkers sought to decenter humanity, to place it at the apex of a pyramid with the rest of the world at its feet, a new humanism would aspire to the precise opposite, to recenter the human, to situate it in the midst of things, from which emplaced center human beings can foster relations with the earth and its manifold inhabitants on a foundation of care. And these are, in essence, relations of kinship. And this kinship has nothing to do with genealogical relatedness. It's not about creating chains, or it's not about tracing chains of genetic connection. In the spirit of a new humanism, animated by its amor mundi, we become kin with creatures of our own and other kinds in the affective relations of going along together, alternately following and being followed, carrying and being carried, begetting and being begotten. Every being is formed within this process not as a node in a network of genealogical connections, but as a knot in a tangle of ongoing lives. But a key question, nevertheless, remains. Why should humans, of all creatures, be alone in shouldering this labor of love, this responsibility of caring for the world? Why should the task of creating kin, or kinning, fall exclusively to us? What, in short, makes humans exceptional? And the answer, I believe, lies in the world's bestowal upon them of a priceless gift, namely the gift of language. Now, this is not language as it was conceived of by philosophers of the Enlightenment. In their conception, language was above all the executive arm of reason, enabling the human beings uniquely endowed with it to think the thoughts they do, to articulate these thoughts with economy and precision, and to communicate them with the maximum of efficiency. It is this conception that informs the design and treatment of language in today's world of digital communication and artificial intelligence, driven by the goal of instant and seamless translation. In this world, all difference of experience, all qualitative variation is immediately flattened. Reason, after all, speaks with one voice and one alone, irrespective of the identity or background of the speaker. But in the new humanism, by contrast, language manifests itself as a polyphony of voices, each brought forth in the stretch of the hearer's oral attention towards its source, and each issuing from somewhere in the world, resounding to the depths of the region to which it belongs, and of the relations it entertains with co-inhabitants. That's why attachment to place and region, so foreign to the old humanism, is fundamental to the new. And it is why the language of the new humanism is less propositional than mythopoetic. Language, in this sense, begins not with speaking, but with listening. We listen out, not just for fellow humans, but for a host of other creatures, from songbirds to insects, whose very presence is shaped in sound. And not only creatures, but multiple other phenomena as well. The whispering trees, the babbling brook, the roaring thunder, the creaking glacier. Yet trees have no ears to hear, and neither does the brook, the thunder, and the glacier. Their voices sound only in the ears of humans. No differently with humans or non-humans, or with animate or inanimate phenomena, it is by extending our oral attention to others that each gains a voice of their own. It's not that nature has its voices, to which we may or may not listen. It is rather that in our very listening, that nature's voices are awakened, brought to life. To hear them is to be reminded that we humans are not just the possessors of a world in which we move around and find our being, but possessed by it. In lending our ears to others, it is they who take possession of us. So, Jakob von Uexküll, Estonian-born naturalist and acknowledged founder of the field now known as biosemiotics, likened the medley of nature's voices, each answering contrapuntally to the others as it sounds, to a chorus. Its harmonies, however, are audible only to human ears. And it's these harmonies that move humans to respond in their own words, in speech and song, in idioms of poetry and myth, which resonate with the sounds they hear. This is a language, then, not of reason, but of resonance, situated not atop the world and in the closeted realm of intellect, but within its midst, in the thickness of affective relations. In its subtle shades, moods, and textures, and in its nuances of tense and voice, it echoes to both the variety and the complexity of the world to which it responds. That's why, for anyone who has not grown up with it, any language of this kind is so very hard to learn. My late colleague, Alan Barnard, with his guitars, my late colleague Alan Barnard, a doyen of hunter-gatherer studies, loved to remind us that the language of the narrow bushmen of the Kalahari in southern Africa, with whom he worked for many years, has no fewer than 86 person, gender, number pronouns and grammatical suffixes. And among Bushman languages, this is not atypical. And the same goes for languages of hunter-gatherers indigenous to other regions of the world. Not only the extraordinary complexity of these languages, but also their diversity, even within a relatively confined region, makes a nonsense of the idea that language evolved primarily as a means of communication. Diversity and complexity, Barnard argues, were there from the start. And in the performance of myth and poetry, as well as in the sheer inventiveness and virtuosity of performers, the resonant power of language would truly have come into its own. It was in the Neolithic era, according to Barnard, that this power began to wane, as a growing human population, now supported by farming and animal husbandry, spread around the globe in waves of settlement and colonization, taking their languages with them. And this expansion, in turn, laid the basis for a more assertive kind of exceptionalism, more hierarchical than centric, set in relations not of kinship, but of possession, of possessing the earth rather than being possessed by it. And with this, language took on the dominant and domineering form that accompanied the formation of kingdoms and the rise of empires. So finally, following the philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, we could call it language in the major key. It's a language of order and command that speaks but rarely listens. And it is in this form, now simplified, homogenized, and democratized in the name of communicative efficiency, that it is spoken by millions of people around the globe today. And yet, despite all this, the chorus of nature has not been entirely silenced. It still murmurs in the background, offering inspiration to writers, poets, and storytellers with the ability to respond in voices of their own. These are voices in the minor key, expressed in words not of command, but of solicitation. It is these voices, close to the ground and ever responsive to variations of experience, and not the singular and superior voice of reason, that can rekindle the resonant power of language in answering to the call of a resurgent nature. They can teach us once more to listen. And in this, learning to listen, surely lies the task of a new humanism. Thank you very much.
manipular el micrófono, no sé si hubieran preguntas. Yo tengo una pregunta y me voy a permitir hacerla mientras el resto va pensando en su pregunta. Y voy a preguntar en inglés. Para que sea. I'll ask this in English so people have a translation. And thank you so much for the inspirational talk. And too many questions, too many turns in a way, given your previous work. But I have a very specific question with regards to something that was sort of launched at the time of Enlightenment, which is the geological revolution. In a way, there was this bunch of people within the Enlightenment that sort of turn around in this trajectory towards the future and start thinking of the past. Came out with conclusions that resonate with what you're talking about, like, say, rocks being birds, and the idea of a past being in front of their eyes, thinking of geologists, archaeologists, and it is remarkable in a way that people that care about tradition, that care about the past, somewhat experience their past in front of their eyes, as indigenous societies do, as you mentioned.
But I think that these geologists you're talking about are very much creatures of the Enlightenment era. They were talking that one of their keywords was stratification, or sedimentation, if they're dealing with sedimentary rocks. So rocks were supposed to form in strata, and strata would be layered over one another, although they might then get mixed up by later telluric forces. So they were thinking of a linear form of time in which more recent layers were superimposed upon earlier layers. And I think that stratified conception is fully in accordance with the way in which, since the Enlightenment, we have tended to think of human history as a sequence of strata, rather than as something like a rope that carries on through the entwinement of its fibers. And now, of course, now we have this story about how the Anthropocene has succeeded the Holocene, which in turn had succeeded the Pleistocene. We get this same picture of stratification writ large, if you like. So with the whole of human history in the Holocene, bracketed by the prehistoric Pleistocene and the post-historic Anthropocene. So I would argue that that geological way of thinking is part and parcel of the Enlightenment scheme.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your speech. A very similar question, but from the other part. Like, it seems that every human practice has been kind of colonized by this way of thinking. And you talked about art. And if I think about contemporary art, which is very recent, very dominated by this way of thinking, do you think that is it possible still to think in a human practice? Practice, I mean, like making something, not like in this practice, which is listening, which is kind of a more passive, acting way of being. Is it possible to not to be always dominating when you are even listening with that attitude of putting your own voice in what you're listening?
I think it is. I think we can find the practices from which we can grow an alternative in everyday practices of kinship. Just look at the, I don't know, watch a family going for a walk. There's mum and dad. There's the little boy on dad's shoulders. There's the girl running along, holding her mother's hand. They're all going along together. facing in the same direction. We don't pay much attention to these ordinary, everyday acts of love and care, but it's out of those that we can see an alternative way of thinking about at the past and the future, I believe. And just because you mentioned contemporary art, I'd like to raise the other point, which is that literally, contemporary means shared time. What if we think of the time not in terms of a chronological sequence, but in terms of a sequence of ancestors and descendants? Then actually the contemporary can be traditional. We could think of the contemporary in a quite different way. And I think that many indigenous artists are trying to tell us to think of art in that kind of way, to say they're making art now, but that art is not radically disconnected from the art that their ancestors made, or that the art that their descendants will make. So it challenges, I think, art, I think, challenges us to rethink the category of the contemporary in ways that could give us a good example for other areas of life.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I'm a bit nervous asking these questions. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that the Enlightenment has made us construct a different type of system, whether it's in science, in politics, whatever. And I think that this leads us to a problem in which now we live in increasingly complex systems. And I wanted to ask you, if we decide and start thinking in a way in which we stop turning our back to nature and to tradition, how can we translate this in systems that are increasingly complex, therefore harder to change? I think that's kind of my question.
Okay, a good question. I think it challenges us to think a bit more carefully about what we mean by words like simple and complex. We're always being told these days that we live in a very complicated world, complex or complicated, they might be a little bit different in meaning, and therefore we need all the help we can get to try and navigate this world. It's why we need all this technological assistance to solve all our multiple problems and so on. and the corollary of that is that the old world, the world on which we've turned our back, was simple. That back then, life was simple. Now it's complicated. I would argue that back then, life was not simple at all. It was just complex, but in a different way than the way it is now. Today, complexity is somehow a matter of joining up or connecting, network-like, an enormous number of different points, little bits, fragments, all over the place. In order to achieve some kind of coherence or direction in life, you have to somehow connect them up. And we're all trying to connect things up. In that other kind of life, suppose that suppose we join with the animals, suppose we join with the creatures with whom we live. They also they have to manage in nature. Their lives are pretty complicated, complex, but for them, it's not a matter of joining up all these little bits and pieces. It's a matter of being very attuned and to subtle variations in experience and knowing how to respond to them. And so it's that attentiveness and that responsiveness that it's in that attentiveness and responsiveness that the complexity lies. It's a different kind of complexity. And I think it's something that we are losing in our modern society, and that it would be good to regain those skills of perception and attention and care which go with it.
Tenemos espacio para, ¿se oye? Sí, tenemos espacio para un par de preguntas más y pueden preguntar en español. Sí.
Thank you. Talk was really lovely. I was wondering if you could speak to this idea of becoming kin with other creatures and the new humanism. I'm wondering, how is it different from indigenous ways of thinking and some casino ways of thinking that already exist? Is it new because it's for people from cities in the West, or is there something else that's essentially different about it?
rather similar and much inspired by what indigenous people have been telling us all along. So I want to make a little clarification about what I mean by new here, because when you hear the word new, you immediately think about replacement, something that we put in place of the old. And of course, if that's what I was after, I would simply be reproducing the same old logic. I'd say, yeah, we've had that old, now I've got this new one that's come along, and this will be even better than what you had before, which would contradict the entire argument. I want to think of newness in a sense similar to that when we talk about celebrating the new year, or when we are delighted with the arrival of a new baby. This is about renewal and rejuvenation, not about novelty. Novelty in a consumer culture such as ours gives us a plethora of ends. You can choose between a million different things, and new things are always coming on the market. And we advertise their novelty because it helps to sell them. But that's not what I mean. I mean newness in the sense of the possibility of perpetual beginning, which comes back to this idea of nascere, to be born, from which we get our word nature. So I want this humanism to be new in the same sense that when Giambattista Vico, the great Italian philosopher, wrote his Nuova Scienza in 18th century, he called it the new science. And the whole point about his new science was that it drew upon the wisdom of past ages in order to think about life to come. That was what his project was, and how it was different from the projects of other thinkers of the time, such as Descartes. And it's that sort of newness that I want to propose.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask, in this new humanism, how would you detach the idea of this progress from the linear time? And if we don't think of time at all as being linear, what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I want to get beyond that sense of linear time. So I think we could have a different understanding of time and temporality, which does not proceed through a series of points. It's not. We have inherited in social science this distinction between synchrony and diachrony, right? Synchrony, the plane of the present; diachrony, one present giving way to another in a temporal sequence. That's the modern view of time. It doesn't correspond with the view of time of many indigenous people who would think quite differently about it. Might be closer to the time of the weather. The weather is always changing, it's never the same from one day to the next. But we wouldn't say that it's progressing anywhere in particular. It's just carrying on and doing its thing. So what I've been thinking about, and it's not in the paper I just given, but I'm thinking about this, is that maybe most people around the world would have an idea of what is before and what is after. It's related to the posture of the human body. This is before, that is after. Most people would have an idea of coming and going. You're traveling to a place, you arrive, you depart. But what is peculiar to our own way of thinking is that we link these distinctions before, after, and going and coming to a distinction between past and future. This is odd. And this idea that the past and the future are entirely separate and the division between them is the present. here in the Congresso Futuro, we've been hearing all about this sense of the future. You know, we are projecting the future for times to come, past, gone. Now we've got this brand new future. This is what's coming ahead. So very, very clear, and that our task in the present is to forge this future by proposing technological solutions for the problems of complexity that we face. And that's where the problem lies, I think. That if we could just, maybe it's all right to use the words like past and future, but if so, they're not easy to tease apart. And certainly for many people around the world, the idea that one could clearly separate them out would appear very strange indeed. And I think it is a product of an extraordinary focus that we have on the present. It appears often in the form of short-termism that, you know, we can't think. I've been thinking since the Enlightenment was roughly 300 years ago when it started, I've been thinking, what can we say about people in 300 years' time? 300 years. How many of our planners, of our technocrats, are thinking in terms of 300 years? They can't get beyond 30 years, and they think they're being far-sighted. So I think, yeah, we could take a different view of time.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful discussion, and please join accompanying me.